Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Palley, and thanks for being with us. Next week, on April 1st, Wisconsin will elect a new justice for its state Supreme Court to replace retiring incumbent Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, one of the court's liberal members. Both parties are looking at the race as a chance to either, retain or regain ideological balance of the court. And in recent weeks, the election has captured national attention, with money flowing into the campaigns for or opposed to both candidates. We previewed this election just a few weeks ago in the show, but let's take another look at it now that we've had a few more weeks transpire. So we'll go into depth with Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square, who has been closely following the race and is a veteran Wisconsin journalist. Dan, great to see you and welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jeff. Glad to be here.
So the Wisconsin SCOTUS race, it's always a big deal. I've been covering this since for 15 years at Ballotpedia, and it seems like it's every year. It's not every year, but it's almost every year. So what makes this year different from the prior big Wisconsin State Supreme Court elections?
Some a little bit different, some of the same. The difference is, we just had another national presidential election last year. Donald Trump is the new president. The recent news is that President Trump endorsed the conservative candidate, which really isn't a surprise here, Brad Schimel, just on Friday night. We wrote about it at the Center Square early Saturday morning. Now, does that going to make a big difference? I don't know. Trump did win Wisconsin in 2024. After losing Wisconsin in 2022, you referenced the 2023 race, which at the time was the most expensive judicial race in the country. This year, it's looking like this iteration of the Wisconsin Supreme Court race is going to blow the 2023 out of the water. Already at least by my count, $59 million spent.
Yeah.
Some are saying it's going to track to $100
Wow.
million by the time April 1st comes around.
Yeah, and and again, for our listeners, if you're not from Wisconsin, this is in name a nonpartisan race. When voters go to the polls, they see nonpartisan labels, but for all intents and purposes, the various ideological and partisan entities and individuals and organizations line up behind their candidate of choice, and it creates pretty clear dividing lines between who's essentially the candidate of the Democratic Party and who's the candidate of the Republican Party and their supporters. So tell us a little about those two candidates. What are their pitches looking like to voters?
Brad Schimel, excuse me, is essentially running on law and order. He's attacked Susan Crawford, who is the quote unquote liberal candidate in this race, the one that's being supported by Governor Evers and Democrats across the country. And he's been trying to hit at least Susan Crawford on her record. Susan Crawford is a past prosecutor. She's a current circuit court judge, out of Dane County, and he's tried to go after her record as a judge. What he is positioning as a soft on crime approach, light sentences for sometimes violent criminals. He's pointed out that based on her record, she's consistently sentenced these criminals to sentences lower than what prosecutors have recommended. Susan Crawford hits back at Schimel. Schimel is former attorney general of the state of Wisconsin. When he first got elected, there was a huge backlog of rape kits that needed to be examined to go forward with prosecution. She hit back at his record as attorney general, saying he didn't do enough early enough to get those rape kits investigated so they can move forward with prosecution. So that's sort of the crime aspect of the race.
So this is just kind of maybe an obvious question, but just for our listeners' sake, where does most of that money go? So if this is one of the most expensive, state Supreme Court races in history, is that primarily just going into high volume of ads and sort of videos in front of Wisconsin voters, or is it kind of unclear where exactly all that money ends up going?
Yeah, we did a story earlier this month at thecentersquare.com on recent polling. This would have been a few weeks ago. That it's a judicial race. It's not a high profile governor's race. It's certainly not a presidential election race. It's not a presidential election year. We did a story on a poll that many registered voters didn't know who these candidates were. Yeah, we all got daily lives. We work. Yeah, we pay attention to presidential races. We pay attention to governors' races, things like that. But these judicial races sometimes slide under the radar. So our story from a few weeks ago said that there were 58% of voters who were polled didn't have enough information about either candidate. The money that's being donated to both campaigns, the tens of millions of dollars, is going mostly on these political advertisements. Of course, in today's political world, yeah, you mentioned it's a nonpartisan race, but this is about as partisan as a nonpartisan race you can get. Are going to attack the opponents and attack each of the opponents on their record, but also to inform voters on here's who you need to vote for. So the vast majority of the money is on these campaign ads. And in the past, I'd like to see a new poll. I haven't seen one yet. I'm not sure if a new one's come out because of all this campaign spending, TV ads, and the like. Voters are probably getting to know the candidates a little bit better, but they're also probably getting a little bit sick of the attack ads that are going on in this race.
Yeah, we've seen that from Wisconsin voters in prior years. Wisconsin typically being a purple state that has, sort of, you could say, larger percentage of swing voters. More,
Right.
so a lot of that, money coming in to try to push them one way or the other. So you mentioned Donald Trump's endorsement. How has that been playing out so far? How has that been received in the race?
About as you would expect. It's not a surprise that Donald Trump is going to endorse the conservative, quote unquote, conservative candidate in this race. He did the same thing in 2023. However, in 2023, the candidate he endorsed, lost that race, and that was the race that tipped the scales of the Wisconsin Supreme Court from a 5-4 conservative majority to a 5-4 liberal majority. And really, that race, the 2023 race, wasn't all that close. So Trump's endorsement really didn't have that much impact in 2023. Now it's a new era. Just 2 years later, voters elected Trump president of the United States, including voters in Wisconsin by tens of thousands of votes. So, is it a different time just 2 years later? It's really tough to say how these endorsements play out. But Wisconsin voters in 2020 rejected Trump after his first term in office, after his first 4 years. But then after 4 years of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, they turned back to Trump. Is that going to have any sway on their opinions and their votes in this race? I really don't know.
Yeah, it's often a very, very close election. These Wisconsin State Supreme Court races, often decided by less than 5 points for margin of victory. So another individual who's been written about quite a bit in this race is Elon Musk, who's donated to the Wisconsin election in recent weeks. And, money coming into this race from outside of Wisconsin is not particularly unique or different, but is the money from Musk different than what we've seen in prior years? Because the stories have been pretty voluminous in the last few weeks about his donations. But what's your observation? What have you seen on that front?
Right. Well, so obviously, Elon Musk now, since Trump was elected to office and he semi joined the Trump administration as the face, at least, of the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, he's become a politically polarizing person right now. If you haven't seen the news about all the attacks on, of course, Elon Musk is the billionaire owner of Tesla, once embraced by Democrats and liberals who, because of their lowering emissions and trying to stem the tide of climate change, etc. He was once supported by Democrats because of what he was doing. But now that he's joined the Trump administration and you've got Doge making all these cuts, he's just become a political polarizing figure. And of course, you've seen these attacks on Tesla companies or Tesla dealerships across the country. So Elon Musk makes headlines no matter what he does or says anymore. Is that going to change anybody's minds? Maybe those voters right in the middle. But then on the other side of it too, you've got George Soros and other like-minded Democratic supporters donating tons of money to Susan Crawford. People who don't like Elon Musk now, yeah, maybe it's going to sway their vote for the liberal candidate, Susan Crawford, in this one. But there's plenty of people too who do like what Elon Musk has been doing. How does it sway those independent voters in the middle? That's going to be what's key here.
Yeah, so if I'm kind of understanding what you're saying, right, is that, over the years in Wisconsin, we've seen national organizations and national individuals, donate money to the candidate or to organizations in support or of their candidate of their choice in Wisconsin, and it's not a terribly unique situation to see something like that.
So I'm based, Jeff. I'm based in the northwest suburbs of Chicago. I actually live in Illinois, but I'm 20 miles from the Wisconsin border, and there's our governor, Illinois' governor, J.B. Pritzker, who's a billionaire himself. He's also financially supporting Susan Crawford in this race. So there's plenty of outside money on both sides that are trying to sway voters to elect their candidate of choice.
So let's talk about some hypothetical outcomes here. There are a number of cases in front of this court. We've written about them in our article at Ballotpedia covering this election. But what are some of the cases or decisions that you've been following that could be impacted by whether there's a liberal majority or a conservative majority on the court after April 1st?
Well, it's good to point that out, Jeff, because this case does have certainly big implications for Wisconsin voters and Wisconsin taxpayers, but there's potential for some national implications too. And let's start with that. Democrats have challenged Republicans' legislative or congressional maps. The Wisconsin Supreme Court last year declined to change those maps, but that very well could become before a new Supreme court again, as you know, currently Republicans hold a very slight majority in the U.S. House of Representatives. Well, there's two like swing congressional districts in Wisconsin that are currently held by Republicans, and if the Supreme Court again takes up the challenge or decides to take up the challenge to the legislative maps in Wisconsin, the congressional maps in Wisconsin, a liberal leaning court could decide to pick up those congressional maps and redraw them, which could affect those two swing congressional races in Wisconsin. And those are the first and third congressional districts. If that were to happen, that could have an impact on in 2026 on which party gains majority control of the U.S. House. So there's the national implication. When it comes to state specific issues in Wisconsin, of course, there's former Governor Scott Walker's Act 10, which severely limited collective bargaining rights of public employee unions in the state. There's a challenge before the constitutionality of Act 10, certainly parts of Act 10, that'll be coming before the Wisconsin Supreme Court, and that would have implications for taxpayers. We've done stories, the taxpayer savings from Act 10. There's a conservative group out there that places the Act 10 savings since it went into effect at $36 billion. Well, if the Wisconsin Supreme Court decides that Act 10 is unconstitutional, that could have implications for taxpayers. There's the abortion issue. Right after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, essentially sending the abortion issue back to the states. There's a debate in Wisconsin about abortion and whether abortion should be legal, how many restrictions should be placed on abortions in Wisconsin. So that is another key issue that could likely will come before the Supreme Court after the April 1st election.
So a heck of a lot of items on this Wisconsin Supreme Court's docket. Yeah, we've
Yeah,
only
and
sure.
I missed one too. I missed one too. The state's voter ID laws. There's a political divide when it comes to whether or not you should be required to show a proof of ID when you go to votes. Many Democrats say that disenfranchises voters. Republicans, conservatives say if you don't have voter ID laws, there's a potential for voter fraud. So that's another issue that could come before the court.
Well, what are you seeing from your stories and your team on the ground? Does it seem like this is an election that has voters really fired up and is going to see higher turnout than prior spring Wisconsin Supreme Court elections, or does it seem like people are, like you kind of alluded to earlier, they're kind of sort of tired of it, or what's the vibe from the
Oh, so
ground?
that was
20 miles from the
that
border.
that poll that we yeah, that poll from 3 weeks ago, Wisconsin voters and residents have been overwhelmed with television advertising, radio advertising, and other things since then. So I certainly think more voters are learning more about each of the candidates since then. Again, it's an off-year election, so you're not going to see the turnout that you saw last year during the presidential election. But and because of all the issues that we just talked about, that'll be impacted by whether there's a 5-4 liberal majority or a 5-4 conservative majority, I can't see how there's not at least improved turnout from past judicial elections. Not going to get to last year's numbers with the presidential election, but I would think turnout is going to be pretty good for an off year election. Which is to say, they're not just in Wisconsin, but these off year elections across the country are always generally turnout is always generally lighter than those big year elections. But I think you're going to see a tick up from 2023 this year.
Yeah, that off-cycle turnout really does depend on the jurisdiction. We've seen off-cycle turnout in places like Texas where it's like 8 or 9%. And, with the
Right.
yeah.
Oh, in Illinois, we see that in Illinois. Yeah.
Yeah, you've got spring elections as well coming up. So yeah, it's going Wisconsin's Supreme Court elections typically are on the higher side in terms of off-year elections, but yeah, certainly not what you see at a November presidential. So what else, Dan? What are your final closing points on the Wisconsin election have we missed?
If you are a Wisconsin voter and you're listening to us, get informed. And this is an important race. This is not a race that has small implications for you and for what happens with a variety of issues in the state. Get to learn the candidates, and please take time to go to the polls either on April 1st or ahead of time, and make your voice heard. As we say, it's sort of become cliche, but if you don't vote, you can't complain about the outcomes, and there can be some significant outcomes depending on who wins this race.
As there always are. And listeners can read all about our coverage on ballotpedia.org, and they can read the Center Square's coverage of this race and many, many other stories as well at your website, which we'll make available in the show notes. So, Dan, thanks for taking the time to come on the show today.
Jeff, thanks for having me again. Have a great day.
You too. And for our listeners, you can learn more about our elections coverage, the link in our show notes. We'll be back with another episode very soon. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Pele, and thanks for listening.